Story 1. Whispering Walls Beneath the Mountain. I'd been exploring abandoned mines and caves around Whitesburg for years, mostly out of curiosity and the quiet thrill of being alone in places people had long since forgotten. That afternoon, I came across a small mine tucked into a ridge where the forest had grown thick, choking sunlight from the narrow opening. The wood timbers at the entrance were rotted and splintered, and the smell of damp earth hit me like a punch. I hesitated for a moment, but something drew me forward. A mix of stubborn curiosity and the kind of foolish pride that comes with knowing you've walked further into these places than most. My flashlight cut a narrow beam across the dark stone, catching glimpses of what might have been old rails and scattered tools. And then I heard it. A low, indistinct murmur echoing off the walls. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind curling through the tunnel or water dripping somewhere in the distance. But then I realized the sound had a rhythm, a cadence that wasn't natural. The murmurs began to form words, soft and sorrowful, like someone pleading, fragmented phrases that rose and fell in a pattern almost like breathing. I stopped and listened, heart ticking faster, telling myself it was just my imagination, but every step I took deeper into the mine made the voices clearer, forming sentences that seemed to speak of pain and regret, voices so mournful I felt a cold sweat gather on my neck. I tried calling out, asking if anyone was down there, but the words seemed to vanish before reaching anyone, swallowed by the stone around me. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with dust and the weight of years untouched. Shadows pooled in corners and alcoves, slipping just out of sight whenever I turned toward them. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by something patient and persistent pressing down from the walls themselves. Then I stumbled upon it. A miner's lantern lying in the dirt, still warm to the touch, though I knew no one could have been there for decades. Its pale light flickered weakly in my hand, illuminating the rough-hewn walls that seemed to pulse with the whispers. Each step I took made the murmurs louder, urgent, as if the stone was breathing, guiding me somewhere, or warning me not to go further. I followed the tunnel, my senses straining. I could hear the faint clink of metal from a collapsed cart, or maybe just my imagination, but it sounded too deliberate, too rhythmic. There were spots where the walls were slick with moisture, and my boots slipped on patches of clay and mud. Every corner I rounded brought more murmurs, more sorrowful, pleading voices. I started to realize the sound wasn't just around me, it was inside me, echoing in my head, syncing with my heartbeat, like it had been waiting for someone to hear it again. I tried to tell myself it was all in my mind, but the warmth of the lantern and the cool weight of the stone made it impossible to dismiss. Somewhere deep in the mine, I saw shadows moving just beyond my beam. Not figures, not people, but movements that suggested intelligence, patience. They slinked along the edges, always out of reach, vanishing whenever I tried to confront them directly. My chest tightened and the whispers escalated, voices overlapping, layering over one another in a chorus of sorrow and warning. I reached a narrow passage that was almost completely collapsed, just enough to squeeze through, and instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something kept me moving, like a pull from the walls themselves. I don't know how far I went, but the tunnel seemed endless, twisting back on itself in ways that made no sense, like it was alive, stretching and contracting in subtle ways. It wasn't until I tripped over a pile of loose rock that I realized I had been walking in circles. The lantern flickered violently, and the whispers rose to a crescendo, overlapping so fast I could barely distinguish one voice from another. Panic set in, raw and consuming. I bolted, scrambling over rocks and through the narrowing tunnels, the voices chasing me, echoing my own frantic breathing. At times, I thought I saw a hand reach for me from the shadows, or maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind snapping under the pressure. I didn't stop until the mouth of the mine was in sight, sunlight spilling over the ridge like a reprieve. Even outside, the whispers didn't leave me. They followed in the wind through the trees, sometimes soft, sometimes louder, always just at the edge of hearing. I tried to explain it to myself rationally, old miners' voices trapped in the stone, echoes of past labor, but it didn't matter. Every time I pass that ridge, every time I hear the wind shift in the hollows, I can feel the mine pressing down again, calling me back into the darkness. And I know, deep down, that it isn't done with me. That those whispering walls remember. And that one day, if I linger too long, they'll pull me back inside where time folds over itself, and the murmurs will become a chorus I can no longer resist. I've told a few friends, some laughed, some shrugged, but none of them really understand the weight of that mine, the way it presses against your skin and your thoughts. Even now, hours, days later, the words slip into my mind at night, the sorrowful pleading echoing between my temples, as if I never really left. I can't explain what I saw, what I heard, or why it felt so alive, so aware. All I know is that I was foolish enough to walk into a place where the mountain itself remembers the lost, and I am haunted by it every single day, by those whispering walls that don't forgive, don't forget, and never, ever let go. As of rooms slinking along baseboards, curling along walls like smoke that doesn't rise. I hear faint scrapes at night when the wind picks up through the holler, shadows moving against shadows. Some nights, when I pass a ridge with a dark opening, I swear I feel that same pressure on my back, the brushing of unseen hands, and my heart thunders with the memory of those twisting, almost human shapes beneath the stalactites. I can't explain what I saw, can't tell myself it was just exhaustion or imagination, and I fear that the cave remembered me, just as it remembered the miners long ago, and that it may yet call me back, pulling me into the dark where shadows learn to watch and never let go. I tell this now not as a tale for curiosity or thrill, but as a warning, because the ridge is still there, jagged and silent, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I hear faint scraping echoes coming from deep within. It isn't animals, isn't the wind. Something waits beneath the stalactites, and if you linger too long, if you look too closely into the dark, it remembers you, and I can't tell you what it wants, only that it leaves its mark in ways daylight can't erase, in the hollows of your mind where the shadows cling long after you've fled. I try to shake it off, but even as I speak, I feel them curling in the edges of my vision, twisting, learning, and waiting. The cave isn't just stone and darkness, it's memory, it's hunger, it's the silent echo of those it has claimed. And sometimes I wake in the night, heart pounding, and I can still feel the weight of the shadows pressing just behind me, reminding me that once you've walked beneath the stalactites, part of you never truly escapes. The ridge looms still, patient, jagged, and I know that one day I might look back, and the shadows, the shapes, the almost human whispers will be waiting for me to step inside again. Story 2. Footsteps in the Abandoned Shaft. My friend had always loved daring me into stupid things, but this time he really outdid himself. "There's an old coal shaft not far from Pike County," he said. "They say no one's been down there for decades. Bet you won't last 5 minutes." I'd always had a fascination with abandoned places, the quiet desolation of structures left to rot. But there's a difference between wandering an old cabin and venturing into a mine shaft that had claimed lives long before either of us were born. The entrance was half swallowed by the hillside, jagged timber supports blackened with age. The smell of wet earth and decay thick in the air. I felt the chill before even stepping inside, a cold that seeped through my jacket and settled deep in my bones. The beam from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. It bounced off slick stone walls and piles of crumbled coal dust, revealing glimpses of the shaft's forgotten history, rusted tools, broken carts, and the occasional timber strut leaning precariously, threatening collapse. I heard my own boots crunching against debris, each step sounding impossibly loud in the silence. And then it began. Another set of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing mine exactly. I froze, every nerve screaming at me to turn around, but there was nothing. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved again, the echo followed. My heart slammed against my chest, the air thick and cloying. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the mine shifting, or maybe some animal skittering in the dark, but it wasn't random. The steps were too precise, too synchronized. I ran, desperate to put some distance between myself and that unseen presence, and the steps accelerated to match my pace. Panic surged in a way that made my head spin, my lungs burning with the effort to climb over rubble and duck under fallen beams. I came to a tunnel that had collapsed, timber and rock blocking any further progress. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, and the steps were still there, echoing, pacing, patient. The air felt heavier here, charged almost, and I realized it wasn't just fear, it was awareness. Something was down there with me, observing, timing its movements, waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel it in the vibrations of the floor beneath my boots, in the way the darkness seemed to thicken around me. I pressed myself against the wall, breath shallow, listening to the slow, deliberate steps. The sound wasn't just behind me anymore. It seemed to encircle me, rising and falling like the tide. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive air. Hours, or maybe just minutes, passed in that suffocating blackness. I don't know if I was moving in circles or if the mine itself shifted, but every time I tried to orient myself, the steps adjusted, always matching my own. I thought about my friend, laughing from the safety of daylight, oblivious to the tension tightening in my chest. My mind started to falter. Shadows danced in the corners of the flashlight's glow, just out of reach. Shapes I couldn't name. I imagined faces in the black, staring, following, waiting for me to falter. Every instinct screamed to retreat. Yet I was trapped by the way the shaft curled and narrowed, pressing me deeper into its bowels. Finally, I found a faint vertical shaft that led upward, the only possible escape. Climbing was treacherous. My hands scraped against wet stone, coal dust filling my lungs, but I was desperate. And the steps followed. They were faster now, but still deliberate, matching every movement, always right there. I reached the surface, stumbled into the undergrowth, and didn't stop running until I hit the dirt road that led back toward the county. I collapsed in the tall grass, shivering, lungs heaving, convinced I had left the sound behind. But when I paused, listening to the forest, I could still hear it, a faint, rhythmic echo in the distance, mocking, patient, never quite gone. Sleep that night was impossible. Every time my eyes closed, I could hear the echoing steps in my bedroom, pacing, circling, matching my own heartbeat. I dreamed of the mine, of the narrow shaft, and the way it seemed to pulse like a living thing, aware and waiting. Each time I tried to wake, I felt the ground beneath me shift slightly, the floorboards in my childhood home trembling as if the presence had followed me out of the darkness. I started avoiding any mention of mines to friends, stopped taking shortcuts through the woods, and yet, even now, I can feel it. Every time I walk alone, every creak of a floorboard or shift in the underbrush, my mind tenses, remembering those measured steps that weren't human, but weren't entirely not human either. I've told people about it, and most laugh, dismissing it as fear and imagination. But I know better. I know what it felt like to be tracked in complete darkness by something deliberate, to feel the mine itself respond to your movements, calculating, patient, endless. I've gone back in my mind over and over, wondering if it was a ghost, a miner long dead, or just my own fear taking shape. But none of the explanations fit. There was intelligence in those steps, a precision that no animal could replicate. And though I've never gone back to that shaft, and I never will, the echo never left me. It's there in the quiet moments, in the creaking of the floor, in the sigh of the wind through the hills, reminding me that some places never forget, that some things wait, always pacing, always patient, waiting for the next fool to follow them into the dark. Even writing this now, my hands tremble slightly. I keep glancing at the shadows along the walls, half expecting them to move in sync with the steps that never truly stopped. And in that lingering silence, I hear it again, slow, deliberate, echoing, and impossible to outrun. Story 3, The Vanishing Light of Hollow Cave. I had been exploring caves across eastern Kentucky for years, chasing the quiet thrill of places people avoided and legends whispered about. That afternoon, I found a narrow, unmarked entrance tucked behind thick underbrush on the edge of a ridge. It was a cave that few ever visited, the sort locals spoke of in passing with caution, warning that it was easy to get lost, that some who entered never came out the same, or at all. I tightened my pack straps and adjusted my headlamp, feeling the cool, damp air wafting from the opening, carrying a smell of earth and decay that made my stomach tighten. The first few steps were easy enough, the beam of light cutting across the jagged walls, revealing the usual signs of forgotten tunnels, loose rock, narrow crevices, and the occasional smear of moisture on the stone. But then, without warning, my headlamp flickered and died. I cursed softly under my breath, fumbling to shake the batteries back into life, but darkness swallowed me completely, absolute and thick. I could feel the cave around me in a way I rarely had, the weight of the stone pressing down, the cool moisture clinging to my skin. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I stood frozen, trying to force my eyes to adjust. When I saw it, a faint glow, pale and uncertain, moving along the walls. It wasn't fixed. It drifted slowly, retreating whenever I reached toward it, always keeping just out of reach. My first instinct was to run, but a strange curiosity held me there, and the light pulsed gently, almost like it wanted me to follow. I took cautious steps, letting the glow guide me deeper into the cave. Each passage felt like a mirror of the last, the walls bending and twisting in ways that seemed impossible. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the entrance. The daylight faintly visible beyond the threshold, as if the cave itself were looping, stretching time and space. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Or perhaps the opposite. Time seemed to collapse entirely in that suffocating blackness. I whispered to myself, trying to ground my thoughts, telling myself I was tired, disoriented, or imagining the light entirely. But every pulse of glow was precise, deliberate, almost aware. The cave narrowed in places, forcing me to squeeze between jagged walls, scraping my shoulders and hands on stone. I could feel small rocks shifting beneath my boots, the faint drip of water echoing like a metronome in the silence. The light moved ahead of me, retreating just enough to keep me on my toes, and I realized with a chill that it wasn't just a random flicker of bioluminescence or reflection. It was guiding me, almost inviting me deeper, yet never revealing what waited at the end. My rational mind screamed that this was foolish, that no light should behave this way in a dead cave, yet I found myself drawn forward, step by cautious step. At one point, I paused, trying to map the tunnel in my memory, but it was hopeless. The same cracks, the same walls, the same strange, glimmering light that always receded from my approach. I started calling out, low and hesitant, my voice swallowed instantly by the stone. I received no answer, only the gentle pulse of glow nudging me deeper, coaxing me into the dark. Anxiety tightened around my chest, and I forced myself to remember the way back, to try to break the cycle. I turned sharply, thinking I could catch the light, but the moment I changed direction, the cave seemed to shift, passages bending impossibly until I found myself staring at the entrance again. My stomach dropped as a slow, sinking realization came over me. This place had no intention of letting me leave so easily. The walls seemed to pulse now, slick with moisture, reflecting faint glimmers of the guiding light in ways that made them appear alive, shifting slightly when I wasn't looking directly. I stumbled through narrow corridors, twisting and crawling at times, and the glow always stayed just ahead. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, but the pull of that strange, living light kept me moving, deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. I thought about turning my back, ignoring it entirely, but the moment I tried, I found myself inexplicably drawn around the same twists and turns, like a rat in a maze designed by the mountain itself. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I stopped trying to count, stopped trying to force my memory to make sense of the shifting tunnels. My hands ached from scraping along rough stone, and my knees burned from crawling, but the glow never faltered, never allowed me respite. At times, I swore I saw shapes flit in the periphery of the light, shadows that vanished whenever I turned, leaving only the pulse ahead of me. It was exhausting, terrifying, and yet compelling. There was a strange rhythm to the cave, a quiet insistence that I follow its paths, that I walk its corridors until it decided I could leave. Eventually, I emerged, or thought I did. The daylight above seemed untouched, serene, as if the cave had never tried to trap me at all. Birds called from the trees, a gentle breeze carried the scent of moss and earth, and the forest seemed completely ordinary. Yet I knew it wasn't ordinary. My heart still pounded, and my hands trembled, coated in mud and stone dust. The memory of that glow, the pulse, the impossible paths clung to me like a second skin. I could still feel the cave's weight pressing in, even in the open air. A lingering pull that whispered of spaces just out of reach, of corridors that had no beginning and no end. Back at home that evening, I couldn't shake the image of the light. In every shadow, I thought I saw it flicker. In dreams, it guided me through impossible tunnels, deeper into darkness where I had no control, where every turn brought me back to the entrance yet somehow farther than before. Rational explanations, bioluminescent fungi, reflections of my flashlight, fatigue, felt hollow against the experience of having the cave itself manipulate perception, coaxing me forward, refusing to let me leave on my own terms. I've returned to those hills many times since, but I cannot find the entrance again. It's as though it only appears when the cave decides I need to walk its corridors, alone in that strange pulse of light. Even now, when I walk through quiet woods at dusk, I sometimes see that faint glow at the edge of my vision, retreating just as I approach, and I feel the same strange compulsion to follow, to lose myself in passages that may not exist. The forest seems normal, the hills calm, yet I know better. I know that somewhere beneath the ridge, winding, twisting, and almost alive, lies the hollow cave, waiting, patient, guiding, and I will never quite escape the memory of its vanishing light. Story 4, scratches on the tunnel walls. We were a small group, mostly friends from around the county, drawn together by the kind of restless curiosity that only comes in these hills. The cave we found was tucked into a hillside off a forgotten dirt road, a place locals spoke of quietly and with uneasy glances. They said it had once been used for moonshine, long abandoned now, the kind of spot where the air itself carries memories of those who came before. I remember the smell immediately, a mixture of damp stone, rot, and the faint tang of something metallic. The entrance was narrow, framed with rough timber long softened by age, and the afternoon light barely touched the floor beyond the first few steps. We joked at first, as you always do, voices echoing off the walls, but the laughter was thin and quick to die, replaced by the weight of the silence inside. Almost immediately, I noticed them. Deep, uneven scratches along the stone walls. They were far too large for human hands, and yet they were deliberate, uneven in depth, but patterned, forming lines and curves that made no sense at first glance. I called the others over, but they shrugged, unconcerned or perhaps unwilling to admit the unease creeping over them. We pressed forward, our flashlights cutting arcs of light across the rough stone, illuminating tunnels that twisted and narrowed. The scratches multiplied as we went deeper, and I began to see patterns, shapes that shifted whenever I looked away, as if the cave itself was aware of our presence, studying us as much as we studied it. The air grew heavier the further we went, tighter, almost suffocating, and the silence became oppressive. Even our footsteps sounded loud, echoing in a way that felt wrong, bouncing back at odd angles, distorting our sense of direction. One of my friends, curious or perhaps foolish, crawled toward a narrow shaft branching off from the main tunnel. He called back for us to look at something, a line of scratches that was deeper, fresher, if that was even possible, and then he vanished. One moment he was there, flashlight trembling in his hands, and the next, nothing. We shouted, clawing at the walls, peering into the darkness, but there was no sound, no sign, nothing but the scratches continuing onward, deeper and darker than anyone dared follow. Panic set in, quiet at first, gnawing at the edges of my mind, and then sharp, clawing, impossible to ignore. We debated going after him, but instinct and fear overruled any courage. The scratches seemed to watch, shifting subtly as though alive, moving when we weren't looking, twisting into new forms. I thought I saw shapes in the shadows, angles and curves that should not have been there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. The cave itself felt patient, intelligent, as if it had been waiting for us, guiding us, deciding when and where we could move. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet I couldn't stop looking at the scratches, trying to understand, trying to make sense of their deliberate, almost knowing placement. We retraced our steps as best we could, though the passages had all started to look the same, tunnels curling back on themselves in ways that made orientation nearly impossible. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and rapid, as if the air itself refused to let us go. I caught glimpses of my missing friend in the shadows, a trick of the light, surely, but enough to make my stomach twist. Every time we turned a corner, the scratches multiplied, deeper, more intricate, forming spirals and angles that seemed impossible to make by any human hand. I began to feel the weight of the cave pressing down, the walls bending subtly as if nudging us forward, deeper into some waiting dark that was patient and deliberate. Hours, or perhaps only minutes, passed in that suffocating stillness. The others whispered, voices trembling, talking about leaving, about calling for help, but no one moved faster than a hesitant shuffle. I couldn't stop staring at the scratches, trying to map their shifts in my mind, and the more I tried, the more the patterns seemed to mock me, rearranging themselves just when I thought I understood. There was intelligence there, a quiet, careful presence, tracking our movements, calculating. The thought of our missing friend haunted me. Not his death, but the strange certainty that he had been absorbed into whatever made the markings, and that the cave had been waiting to claim him. Eventually, we decided to leave, but even the path back seemed wrong. The cave had changed subtly while we were inside, tunnels shifting and narrowing, ceilings seeming lower, air colder and heavier. I remember every step feeling measured, as if the cave itself were pacing us, testing our resolve. By the time we finally emerged into the fading light outside, our breaths ragged and limbs trembling, the hillside looked untouched, serene, as though the cave had never tried to trap us at all. But I knew better. I knew what had waited inside, patient and calculating, and I knew what it had left behind. The scratches, deep and knowing, an echo of some intelligence older than any of us, waiting quietly for the next curious fools to follow its paths. I still wake at night thinking about those scratches, the deliberate patterns, the way they seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye. I see them in shadows, in cracks in the walls of my own home, fleeting, impossible, but insistent. I can't explain why one of my friends vanished, or why the others haven't spoken of it much, but the memory lingers, pressing in like the walls themselves. There is a patience in those markings, a quiet, observing awareness that unsettles me even now. The cave may never claim me again, but it has left its mark. I can feel it in my thoughts, in the way I hesitate before stepping into shadowed spaces, in the way I sometimes glance at the walls around me and imagine them shifting, moving, watching. That cave, those scratches, and the quiet intelligence behind them have stayed with me, patient, persistent, a reminder that some places in these hills are alive in ways we cannot understand, and that some intelligence, though quiet, will always wait for those foolish enough to enter its domain. Story 5. The Breath Behind Me. I had been warned about the old mines scattered through Harlan County, told in hushed voices over campfires and at the back tables of bars, where the men who claimed to know still shuddered. Curiosity, or maybe foolishness, led me there on a damp autumn morning. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that made the birds hold their breath and the wind tiptoe through skeletal branches. I found the collapsed shaft tucked into a slope, partially hidden by a curtain of ivy and mud, its gaping mouth smelling of wet stone and decayed roots. The stories said miners had vanished here decades ago, swallowed by the tunnels or driven mad by something else. I told myself I was here just to see, to feel that old, earthen history, but that self-assurance began to crumble the moment I stepped inside. The air was immediately thick, a stale, metallic weight that clung to my lungs. Each step on the loose rubble echoed down the shaft, bouncing back at me in distorted, delayed rhythms, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. My flashlight was weak, its beam trembling as I angled it over jagged rock. I moved slowly, trying to make sense of the shadows. There were none, not human ones, at least. And then I felt it, a quiet, deliberate inhalation so close it seemed to brush the back of my neck. My skin prickled and my stomach lurched. I spun around, the light slicing through the darkness, but the shaft was empty. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, yet the sensation lingered, a pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath myself. I swallowed, trying to calm my rising panic, telling myself it was the wind, or maybe the echo of my own movements, and I pressed deeper into the tunnel. My boots kicked small stones, and the sound bounced like whispers off the walls. The air grew heavier the farther I went. Hotter in the absence of sunlight, and every inhale tasted of rust and damp earth. I could feel eyes on me, not mine, and not those of any animal I had ever known. This presence was patient, deliberate, and cold. I told myself to stop imagining things, yet the pressure behind me never eased, the slow brush of breath seeming to linger just beyond my reach. Then I heard it. Laughter. Not loud, not brash, but thin, quiet, echoing as if the walls themselves had learned how to mock. My flashlight flickered, casting the walls in a sickly, unsteady glow. I spun again, searching for anything, someone, something, but there was nothing. Just rock, dust, and shadows that seemed to shift when I blinked. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I realized I had no idea how deep I'd gone or how to retrace my steps. The tunnel had turned, curved, doubled back, a labyrinth without map or memory. I tried to run, my legs pumped, kicking up the fine powder that settled in clouds around me, choking my lungs. The echo of laughter followed me, distant yet impossibly close, folding over itself until I couldn't tell whether it was behind me or inside my own head. And then the breath. Slow, measured, teasing. Every time I quickened my pace, it matched me step for step, synchronized with my heart. I forced myself not to scream, not to draw attention to the fact that I was alone and utterly vulnerable. But even my silence felt inadequate, as if the thing behind me demanded acknowledgement, feeding on my awareness of it. The tunnel narrowed, rocks shifted underfoot, and I had to squeeze through a space so tight I could feel the weight of the earth pressing in from all sides. The breath followed, patient and deliberate, brushing over my hair and shoulders, teasing me with its impossible closeness. I turned again, flashlight shaking, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw a figure, human-shaped, impossible thin, impossibly still, but when I blinked, the wall was empty. I stumbled forward, blindly, the beam of light cutting a small circle in the blackness. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet the passage ahead seemed to offer a strange, dreadful promise of escape, if only I could reach it. Minutes, maybe hours passed, or maybe they overlapped, stretched and collapsed in that suffocating, timeless dark. I can't be sure. The laughter had ceased, replaced by a tight, oppressive silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic brushing of breath on the back of my neck. The weight of it was unbearable, pressing against my chest, my skull, my memory of the outside world. I stumbled over a rock and fell, scraping my palms, and when I tried to rise, the floor seemed to shift beneath me, a soft, almost imperceptible movement that I could not explain. I found a narrow seam in the rock that angled upward and pushed myself toward it, my limbs trembling, mind fraying. The light of my flashlight revealed nothing but rough stone, but something about that upward slant felt like a promise. I crawled, forced my body through the tight space, and the presence never left. Every breath I took, every movement, every heartbeat was mirrored in that invisible companion. I could almost feel its amusement, a calculated patience that no human mind could hold for long. Then suddenly, the world opened. The air became lighter, cooler, scented with wet leaves and moss. I stumbled out of the mouth of the collapsed shaft into the dim twilight of the forest. The woods were quiet, ordinary, undisturbed by the nightmare I had just crawled through. The hillside was solid, familiar. Birds flitted in the branches. A breeze rustled the leaves. Nothing seemed to remember what had happened underground. I leaned against a tree, shivering, and dared not look back. Even now, weeks later, I feel the weight of that presence behind me, in the shower, in my bed, even walking the familiar roads near my cabin. I sense it, patient, waiting, pacing just beyond sight. The breath returns, slow, deliberate, always close. Sometimes it feels like a whisper at the nape of my neck, and I startle as though someone is actually there, though there is never anyone. I have told myself countless times it was imagination, the effect of isolation, stress, the weight of old stories. But there are nights when I swear I hear the faintest laugh, a breath that is not mine, a step that perfectly matches my own. I never went back to that shaft. I can't. Even the memory of it bends the air in my lungs, turns my stomach. I dream of it. Narrow passages that twist impossibly, laughter echoing from every corner, and the slow, measured presence behind me, unyielding, unrelenting. The forest outside seems indifferent, the sun rising and falling as though nothing had happened. But I know better. Something was down there, something that waited and watched, patient as the stone itself. And though I have escaped, I carry it with me still. Every shadow in my cabin, every gust of wind through the trees, every quiet moment of night brings the memory back, the sensation of being followed, always followed, by a breath that is not mine. Story 6. The Forgotten Lantern. I found the tunnel almost by accident, tucked behind a stand of scrub pines on the far side of the ridge. The mouth of it was choked with debris, rocks, and fallen timber, as if the hillside itself were trying to hide whatever lay within. I'd been wandering the old mining roads for hours, looking for signs of past shafts and the occasional rusted tool, the kind of relics left behind by men who risked their lives for coal that smelled of nothing but smoke and sweat. When I squeezed through the narrow opening, the air hit me first, heavy, damp, with that tang of iron and mold, the kind that clung to your clothes and hair. I shivered and fumbled in my pack until my hand closed around the lantern. It was an old thing, copper with a cracked globe, and though the wick was brittle, I dared to light it. The flame that sprang up was wrong, pale blue, flickering as if it were reluctant to burn. The first thing I noticed was the walls. The light cast shadows that didn't match the rock formations, grotesque and almost human in their shapes. I froze, and when I moved the lantern, they moved with me, stretching and twisting in ways that made my stomach tighten. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. The brain has a way of bending things in the dark, of taking the rough shapes of rock and turning them into faces and gestures. But the shadows didn't just suggest movement, they acted. I saw two figures arguing, hands raised, shoulders heaving in fury. Their faces were contorted with frustration, mouths open as if shouting words I couldn't hear. Then one figure collapsed, a wall of rock seeming to fall upon him. Another screamed, its shadow melting into the darkness before my eyes, leaving me staring at the empty tunnel with my heart in my throat. I stumbled back, but the shadows pressed closer, as if aware of me. As if the flame itself were a spotlight showing me a private, terrible history. I kept walking, lantern held high, trying to convince myself that I'd just glimpsed some trick of light or a residue of memory left in the stones. But the deeper I went, the more insistent the shadows became. They began to act out entire scenes, some violent, some mundane, all with a sense of haunting familiarity, like a play being performed for a witness long after the actors had died. Miners arguing over who would get the next cart down the shaft. Someone dropping a pickaxe and bending to retrieve it, only for the tunnel to shudder and cave in. Faces frozen in fear, mouths screaming, eyes wide, and always, the sense that these figures could see me as much as I saw them, as if the pale blue flame had summoned me into their theatre of horror. The air grew heavier with each step. Sweat soaked my back, even though the tunnel was cold and the walls felt like they were closing in. I began to recognize that this wasn't just a simple mine. It felt deliberate, like the tunnels had been carved not only into the earth but into the memory of those who had perished there. The flame of the lantern seemed to pulse, guiding me deeper, twisting around corners that shouldn't have existed. Every passage felt longer than the last, and though I moved steadily, I kept ending up in spaces I'd already passed. There was a logic to it, a cruel geometry I couldn't comprehend, but it all led downward, further into the mountain. I heard my own breathing, ragged and loud, and the occasional drip of water from somewhere far above. But behind it all, there was something else. A soft, deliberate sound, almost like whispers echoing off the walls, carried on the hollow wind of the shaft. I strained to hear, convinced it was the echoes of the miners, or perhaps rats. But it was more purposeful than that, an almost conversational undertone. It made my skin crawl, and then I noticed something I can't forget. The shadows themselves were changing when I looked away. I'd glance at one, and it was a man falling, screaming, and when I turned back it was different. A miner crouching over a lamp, watching, waiting. The realization came with cold clarity. I was not just observing these echoes, I was interacting with them. The lantern had called me here, and now, somehow, I was part of their story. Panic rose, a physical weight pressing on my chest, and I knew I had to leave. I swung the lantern around, searching for the entrance, for any sign of daylight or open air. The tunnel twisted again, then again, a labyrinth carved of rock and memory, refusing to give me an exit. I began running, one hand on the wall, the other holding the trembling lantern. Shadows lashed at me as I passed, small figures reaching, shouting, pleading, their motions urgent and precise. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning down there, minutes and hours blending together into a pulse of fear that threatened to consume me. At some point my foot caught on a jagged stone, and I tumbled. The lantern slipped from my grip, hitting the ground with a hollow clang. I scrambled to grab it, but the glass shattered, and the pale blue flame sputtered, winked out. In the sudden darkness, I froze, heart hammering, expecting the shadows to consume me entirely. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the echoing drip of water. Then, slowly, as I backed away, the images remained, not projected in light now, but carved into the inside of my skull, replaying themselves unbidden. Every gesture, every scream, every argument. Their echoes were mine, impossible to forget. I found the mouth of the tunnel after what felt like forever. I emerged into the late afternoon sun, the forest quiet as if nothing had happened. The slope of the hill untouched and ordinary. My limbs shook, and the world outside seemed unreal. The air too bright, too clean. The rustling leaves and birdsong felt almost hostile in their cheerfulness. I didn't look back, not really, but I could feel the memory of that lantern, the shadows it had thrown, following me still, like a weight on my chest I couldn't shake. Even now, nights are the worst. I wake in the darkened cabin where I live alone, and in the corner of my eye, I think I see those movements, gestures, arguments, the collapse of stone. The pale blue light is gone, the lantern destroyed, but the images refuse to leave. I hear the faintest sound of a pickaxe striking rock, a voice muttering in anger or fear, and I imagine for a moment that the tunnel waits for me to return. I know I should never go back, but the knowledge that it is still there, that the events I saw were not random, that something within those walls remembers me as I remember them, gnaws at the edges of my mind. I cannot explain why, but I feel it. The mine, the lantern, and the shadows. They are patient, and they are waiting. And in the quiet hours when the wind moves just so and the trees creak like old bones, I wonder if the blue flame never really went out at all. Story 7. Echoes of the Lost Miners. I never meant to go back into those hills, but something about that old rumor pulled me in like a tether I couldn't cut. They called it Hollow Creek Cave, tucked beneath the ridge like a dark wound in the mountainside, and they said miners had vanished there decades ago, swallowed by darkness or by whatever lived in the shadows. I had grown up hearing the stories from folks in Harlan County, the kind of tales whispered over wood smoke and coffee that make a body sit a little straighter and the hair on your neck rise. Curiosity always has a stubborn way of biting you, though. And I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The entrance was nothing more than a jagged slit in the rock, half choked with roots and dirt, smelling of mold and old decay. The air felt wrong the moment I crossed its threshold, thick and stale, as though the mountain itself had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter. I took my flashlight out and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the black like a dull knife. The walls were rough and slick with moisture, and every footstep echoed back at me, but it wasn't just the sound, it felt alive, like the cave was listening. I called out a tentative hello, expecting nothing, and the silence returned. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, but then came the whispers. Faint, almost too soft to catch, but unmistakably voices. John. John. They drifted just beyond the light's reach, brushing the edges of my consciousness. My throat tightened. I swallowed and called back, my voice cracking in the damp air. Who's there? The reply came almost immediately, and I froze. It was my own words, twisted, stretched into something mocking. Who's there? It wasn't echoing naturally. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was repeating me, reshaping my voice into something that sounded wrong, like the laughter of something that had spent decades waiting for a human soul. I shivered and forced myself to move, flashlight in hand, sweeping the walls for signs of life. Shadows shifted unnaturally, elongated and twitching along the jagged rocks, slipping away whenever I turned to face them fully. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I was drawn deeper, a horrible curiosity gnawing at my spine, whispering that the answers were just a little farther in. The whispers became clearer as I walked, names now joining my own. Samuel, Henry, Mary. I had heard these names before, old miners from the county records, men and women who had vanished without a trace. I pressed my hand against the wet stone, feeling the slight give of decades of erosion beneath my fingers, and the voices seemed to swirl around me, dancing just beyond the cone of light. At one point, I swore I saw a figure standing in a side tunnel, leaning against the wall, head cocked in a way no living person could hold. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart thumped so loud, it felt like it would betray me, and I forced my legs to carry me forward despite the fear clawing at my ribs. Deeper still, the tunnel narrowed. My flashlight flickered as I passed over old tools and rusted carts. The remnants of lives cut short. The whispers followed me, now urgent, almost pleading. I felt watched from every angle, but whenever I swung my light, nothing was there. I began to call out, asking questions I didn't expect answers to. Why? What happened to you? The reply came in a chorus, layered and overlapping. Why? 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 Each repetition a different pitch, a different cruelty. My stomach twisted, and I stumbled over a rock, catching myself just before I fell. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The tunnel seemed to loop, twisting back on itself in impossible ways. I could feel the cold seep into my bones. The air growing stale and heavy, smelling of wet stone and something older, something forgotten. My flashlight picked out shapes just beyond the beam, figures crouched, hunched, always watching, always vanishing if I tried to look too long. I told myself it was shadows, tricks of light and exhaustion, but there was a weight in the air, a presence that pressed against me, patient and unblinking. At one point I reached a chamber that opened wider than the rest. The ceiling dripped with water, and the whispers came louder here, as though the voices themselves had pooled into the room. I could make out movement. Small figures darting behind stalagmites, their shapes impossible to hold in memory. And then the unmistakable sound of someone stepping directly behind me. I froze, breath caught in my chest. Every hair on my arms bristled. Slowly I turned, expecting a friend or a hallucination, but nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than the whispering, oppressive and patient. I took a step back, then another, and felt the shift of air, the movement of a presence that had been there all along. I stumbled over a rock and fell to my knees, chest heaving. My flashlight wavered, and in that trembling cone of light, I saw them, or at least the suggestion of them. Faces without features, torsos bending at odd angles, limbs twitching like those who had long been denied rest. The whispers became a chorus again, and I understood in that moment that the cave itself remembered, held the echoes of those who had been claimed, repeating their final moments over and over, mocking and pleading simultaneously. I scrambled backward, adrenaline burning through my veins, forcing my legs to carry me toward the narrow exit. By the time I reached the daylight, I could barely breathe. The sun felt alien, sharp and bright against eyes that had adjusted to decades of darkness. I collapsed into the soft earth outside, trembling uncontrollably, still hearing the echoes, still feeling the unseen eyes watching from within the mountain. I didn't speak of it for days, and when I finally did, the words felt hollow. No one could understand what I had seen, what I had heard, the weight of decades pressing against my chest. The memory has stayed with me, growing sharper in the quiet moments, when the wind moves through the trees just so, when the hills look like they're bending toward you, waiting. Even now, I feel it, the cave's awareness. Patient and persistent. I see it in the shadowed corners of rooms, in the way silence sometimes seems to press on my eardrums. I know the mountain remembers me, as it remembered the others, and I know that one day it might reach out to reclaim what wandered too close. I can still hear the whispers faintly, like a half-remembered song carried on the wind, twisting my own words against me. The figures never leave. The cave never forgets. And the memory of what I saw, of what I felt, is etched into my mind in a way that sunlight cannot cleanse. Even now I can feel the cold press of stone against my back when I close my eyes, and the soft, patient chorus of those who were lost, waiting, always waiting, just beneath the hills of Harlan County. Story 8. The Cold Hand in the Darkness. I remember the first time I went down that old shaft like it was yesterday, though it was years ago. The air was thin, tinged with the sharp tang of iron and damp earth, and the entrance had long been choked with brambles, as if the woods themselves were trying to hide it from prying eyes. I'd heard the stories from the old-timers about the mine collapsing decades back, about men who'd vanished into its belly and never returned. But I'd never paid much mind until that winter day when curiosity, stubborn as the frost on the hillside, drew me there. My boots crunched over frozen leaves and splintered timbers as I made my way down the slope, each step sinking slightly into the icy mud. The light from my lantern danced across the rough walls, revealing jagged seams and the occasional rusted tool left behind, frozen in time like a warning I didn't yet understand. The cold was biting, creeping through my coat, my gloves, into my bones. I swallowed hard and descended the shaft, the narrow walls pressing in on me until it felt like I was crawling into the chest of the mountain itself. At first, it was just the usual sounds. The wind groaning through broken timbers, the occasional drip of water echoing down into the darkness. But then, I felt it, a brush of cold against my wrist, like a sudden frostbite that wasn't coming from the air. I whipped my head around, heart thundering, but there was nothing but shadows, twisting with the lantern's pale glow. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was the wind, or maybe my own imagination. But when I moved my hand to rub the cold away, the grip came again, firmer this time. It was like fingers, skeletal and ice cold, curling around my wrist, holding me still. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Swallowed by the oppressive silence, of the mine. The walls seemed to lean closer, dark and unforgiving, and the narrow shaft suddenly felt endless. A corridor to some place I wasn't meant to enter. I scrambled backward, lantern swinging, and the hand followed, brushing against my shoulder with a weight that made my skin crawl. I could feel the icy pressure dragging me, testing my resolve, and panic flared like a fire in my chest. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps that froze in the air before me. I didn't look for the hand, didn't want to see it, yet I couldn't ignore the unmistakable sensation. A cold pulse like the mountain itself was breathing against me. Every instinct screamed to get out, to climb, to escape, but the shaft narrowed further down, jagged rocks threatening to tear my hands and clothes. I moved faster, adrenaline sharpening my senses, listening to the soft thud of my boots against packed earth, the scraping of metal and stone as the fingers brushed again and again. I remember my mind sliding into fragments of memory, thoughts of old miners trapped decades earlier, the stories of frost-bitten hands found clutching rusted tools, their faces frozen in terror. It was as if the mine remembered them. And now it remembered me. Every step I took seemed to echo, not just with my own movement, but with something heavier, slower, deliberate, something unseen tracking my every motion. The cold hand would occasionally brush against my back, tugging at my sleeve, dragging me toward the darkness, and I could feel a weight there, a presence that didn't belong to the living world. I screamed once, my voice hollow and shivering, and for a moment the hand retreated, though not far enough to let me breathe freely. I clawed upward, grabbing splintered beams, digging my fingers into frozen dirt. Each inch gained felt monumental. Each scrape of nail against wood, a lifeline. I could hear the wind outside faintly, like a distant promise of warmth, and it gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. The hand stayed near, persistent, and I felt it graze my neck this time, a lingering brush that sent chills deeper than any winter cold could. I wondered if it was real, or if the mine had claimed my mind first, twisting perception with the stories of men lost to its depths. My lantern swung wildly, casting long, jittering shadows that danced like the hands of the dead themselves, and I knew I had to keep moving or be swallowed completely. Finally, with a surge of desperate effort, I hauled myself through the last, narrow stretch, lunging for the rough timber rim of the opening. I emerged gasping into the sharp winter air, my legs shaking, my skin tingling from frostbite and terror alike. The sun was pale, diffused through low-hanging clouds, and for a moment the world felt normal, deceptively calm. I stumbled down the hillside, boots slipping on frozen mud, and I didn't stop until the cabin I'd left behind was a safe distance away. The forest whispered around me, wind tugging at branches like invisible fingers, and though I was free of the mine, I could still feel that icy touch lingering, ghosting over my arms and shoulders as if it had followed me. Since that day, I can't pass any abandoned entrance without feeling the memory of it. A hillside, a hollow in the ground, a simple gash in the earth. Those are enough to make my skin crawl, enough to bring that chill back to my bones. Sometimes at night, I wake in my cabin, lanterns unlit, but I can feel the cold pressing against my wrist as I turn in bed. It's never the same as the day it happened, not quite as strong, but it is enough to remind me that whatever I encountered wasn't just a figment of my imagination. There's a permanence to it, a claim that doesn't let go. I've tried to tell people what happened, but no one believes a grown man can feel the cold grip of a mine like that, can be followed by hands that aren't there. They think it's exhaustion, or a trick of the mind after hiking alone through winter forests. But I know better. I know the way the shaft leaned in, the way the darkness seemed alive, the way the cold hand kept pace with my fear. And even now, years later, walking past hillsides that hide broken timbers and yawning earth. I feel it brushing against me, testing, patient, like it remembers me too. I don't know if it's the mountain or the spirits of those who never left, or something else entirely. All I know is that the memory is sharp, and the fear is constant, and the winter air will never feel warm again. Even when the sun shines and the woods are quiet, I sense it there, waiting in the forgotten hollows, in the shadowed mouths of old shafts, in the frozen mud where no footprints have yet been made. It doesn't chase me, not in the way a predator would, but it doesn't have to. Its presence is enough to make every heartbeat feel like it's echoing through a cavern that wants to claim me slowly, inexorably. I've stopped going back. But the memory has stayed, etched into my skin, and every time I pass a hillside or hear the scrape of ice against stone, I feel it again, fingers brushing, patient, watching, and I know, with a certainty I cannot shake, that some things in the mountains do not forget, and they do not forgive. Story 9. Shadows beneath the stalactites. I'd been drawn to that ridge for weeks, ever since an old-timer in the holler muttered about a cave that had swallowed more than a few folks back in the 30s. The kind of place no one dared map, where the walls were slick with condensation and the air smelled of rot and mineral dust. I told myself it was curiosity, or maybe stubborn pride, that led me there one grey morning, when the sky hung low and the wind had that keen whistling edge only winter knows. I parked at the foot of the ridge, the truck crunching over frozen leaves, and squinted at the narrow mouth of the cave. Rimmed with jagged stalactites that looked like broken teeth, something in the way the shadows pooled around the entrance made my stomach tighten, but I brushed it off and hoisted my pack, feeling the weight of a flashlight and rope pressing down my shoulders. The first steps inside were cautious, almost tentative. The cave swallowed the daylight, leaving me with only the weak cone of the flashlight. The floor was uneven, littered with shattered rock and ancient mud, and every scrape and scuff echoed in a hollow, accusing way. That's when I noticed it. The shadows. They didn't behave like shadows should. They didn't cling obediently to the angles of the rock or stretch predictably with my light. Instead, they twisted and writhed, slipping around corners faster than I could turn, creeping along walls where no light touched. My heart hammered in my chest, and a cold sweat ran down my spine. I shook my head, muttering to myself that it was nothing, that the eye catches shapes in the dark and spins stories. But as I moved deeper, the shapes began to take form. Thin, elongated figures that seemed to lean forward with a grotesque curiosity, always just beyond the flashlight's reach. For a moment, I thought I saw them step closer when I wasn't looking directly, like they were watching from some sliver of darkness I couldn't penetrate. My pace quickened. I tried to tell myself it was my own mind playing tricks, the isolation pressing on me, the silence gnawing at my reason. But the shadows weren't static. They twisted into what could almost have been faces, mouths open in silent screams, hands stretching toward me and recoiling, always jerking away before I could see them clearly. I found myself whispering into the dark, calling my own name just to hear a voice. The cave didn't answer, not with sound, but with movement. The shadows responded. A hand stretched from a wall to mimic mine, or a body curled in a hollow like it had seen me before. Every twist of the beam revealed something new, something vaguely human, yet wrong, as if the walls themselves were learning, reshaping in secret memory. A distant drip echoed, then another, and it felt like footfalls following me. I told myself it was nothing, yet my chest tightened with every step, and the feeling of being pressed from behind grew heavier, almost physical. The stalactites above caught flecks of light and cast spikes that sharpened the shadows. At one point, I stumbled, catching myself on the jagged wall, and glanced back. A figure, or something like it, had formed behind me in the black, crouched just beyond reach, melding with the wall like a smear of coal. My flashlight flickered, and I swear it leaned forward, peering at me from the dark before melting back into nothing. My breathing became ragged. I forced myself to keep moving, head down, ears straining for a sound that might confirm I was still alone. But every time I blinked or turned my head too fast, there it was again. The shadow, pressing, curling around corners, lingering at the edge of vision like it had learned my every move. The cave narrowed into a tight crawl, and the walls pressed in. The cold seeped deeper than the winter air outside, snaking along my bones. My hands scraped the rock, and I felt the shadows grow closer, heavier, until I could almost feel a pressure on my back, a brush of something unseen. My pulse was a drum in my ears, and every instinct screamed to turn and run, yet some perverse curiosity rooted me in place. I whispered a shaky apology, though to whom I didn't know. When I finally saw the faint light of the entrance far ahead, hope surged. My legs carried me forward, stumbling over rocks, lungs burning, but the shadows didn't relent. They clung, moving in ways that defied any logic, pressed to the walls, the floor, the ceiling, always following, always just out of the beam. I reached the mouth of the cave, stumbled into daylight, and the cold outside felt like warmth compared to the pressure inside. I dared to glance back, and though the sun struck the ridge, the shadows seemed to linger at the edge of the cave's teeth, dark stains against the rock, not cast by the sun or any object. Even now, days later, they linger in my mind. I see them in the corn. Story 10. The Silent Scream Underground. I remember the first time I stood before the mouth of the old mine, its entrance like a gaping wound in the side of the hill. Snow had already begun to melt into thick, muddy slush, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. No one in the county went near that place anymore. The miners who once worked there had vanished decades ago, and the stories the locals told were more warnings than tales. But I had a job to do. I had to document the structure, assess its stability, nothing more. I told myself that as I tightened my boots and lifted my flashlight. The cold made my fingers stiff, but the deeper chill, the one that seemed to come from the earth itself, reached past my gloves and into my chest. The mine mouth swallowed light almost immediately. My flashlight revealed jagged timbers and crumbling stone, the walls slick with frozen moisture. I stepped inside slowly, letting the beam sweep across rusted tools, old carts, and the faint chalk outlines of letters scratched long ago. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't ordinary. There was a pressure, a weight that made the air seem thicker, as if the mine itself was watching. I paused, thinking I heard a faint thrum, an echo of something deep below, but shook my head. I told myself it was nothing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, loud enough to make me wonder if anyone could hear it in the darkness beyond. Then I felt it. At first, it was just a vibration in the floor, subtle and almost like a shiver from the earth itself. But soon, it became something else. A presence pressing so heavily that I could feel it in my bones. And then, impossibly, I sensed the scream. It wasn't audible. No one could have heard it, but it was there. A pure, unrelenting agony that seemed to coil around my lungs and squeeze. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air didn't carry a sound, yet my chest vibrated with a raw, electric panic. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The scream! It wasn't coming from the walls, it wasn't coming from any direction. It was coming from the mine itself, from the heart of the earth, from something that had waited decades to reach the surface. I forced myself to move forward, convinced that if I reached the collapse section I had marked on the map, I could finish the survey and leave. Each step was heavier than the last, the ground slick beneath my boots, the roof pressing down as if narrowing the passage. I could feel the walls bending toward me, inch by inch, though I knew it wasn't possible. My mind whispered that it was a trick, that panic made the shadows alive, but every instinct screamed otherwise. The scream came again, silent in its sound, but loud enough to make me stumble. It seemed to twist around me, curling into my stomach, and I gagged. I reached for the walls, the rocks scraping my palms raw, and it felt like the mine was pulling me in deeper, not letting me leave. Somewhere in that crushing silence, I became aware of shapes moving at the edge of my vision. Not humans, not exactly, but outlines, vague and slinking, as if the very darkness had taken form. They didn't make noise. They didn't blink or breathe, yet I felt them, a presence brushing close, pressing cold fingers through the very marrow of my bones. Every step I took seemed mirrored by these shapes. When I raised my flashlight, they shifted, avoiding the light, slipping behind pillars and timbers just beyond reach. My rational mind fought to explain it. Shadows, trick of the beam, my nerves fraying, but instinct told me the mine had a memory, a living recollection of the men it had claimed, and I had awakened it. I reached the collapsed shaft, the place where decades before, a small explosion had trapped several miners inside. The floor was uneven, piled with rocks and rotting timber, and the air reeked of something old and sour. I bent to examine the entrance, measuring, taking notes, trying to focus on something tangible. And then the feeling hit me fully, solid and suffocating, that the scream was wrapping itself around me like a chain. I couldn't breathe without it pressing harder, couldn't speak without my words twisting in my throat. I wanted to turn back, to flee into the daylight, but the mine had shifted. Where the passage had been, there was only stone. The walls pressed in, cold and unyielding, and the silent scream reached into my head, making me see, hear, and feel everything at once. Panic surged and I bolted blindly, scraping my knees against rocks, my flashlight bouncing and throwing shadows that danced grotesquely across the walls. The shapes followed. They never ran, never chased, but they were there, clinging just outside the circle of light, pressing on my back. I felt them brush my shoulders, my hair, my neck, and I screamed, finally, my own voice breaking the silence. But the mind swallowed it immediately. The echo wasn't a sound, it was a sensation, as if my fear had been absorbed and returned in denser, heavier waves. I stumbled, fell, clawed at the timbers, and somehow managed to find the entrance again, collapsing into the cold winter light outside. My lungs burned from screaming and running. My hands were bloody from gripping splintered wood, and yet the terror didn't leave. It followed me, invisible but tangible, curling around my ribs like smoke. Even now, years later, I feel it. I pass old hillsides and mine entrances, the abandoned remnants of shafts and shafts of stone, and my chest tightens. The silent scream is never far away. Sometimes in the quiet of my cabin, when the wind presses against the window panes, I feel it again, a pressure, a shiver down my spine, a memory of that subterranean grip. I can't hear it with ears, but I feel it with every nerve, as if the mine has left a mark on me, as if some fragment of its memory clings to my bones. Friends have noticed the change, the way I flinch at shadows, the way my hands tremble when the wind carries distant noises. I tell them it's nerves or exhaustion or the work of imagination, but I know better. I know what waits in those shafts, what echoes in the stone and timber. It doesn't need to be heard to be real. I've thought about returning in moments of foolish curiosity, but I can't. The mine doesn't welcome visitors. It remembers them. and it remembers them silently, fully, and endlessly. Even this telling, the attempt to put it into words, makes my chest tighten, my fingers curl. I know that it has left a permanent impression, a shadow in my body that no sunlight can reach. The silent scream is patient, waiting for the moment I become careless, the moment I step too close again. And I know that one day it will find me, not with noise, not with shouts, but with the same cold, crushing presence that I first felt in that underground darkness. Until then, I live with the memory, every quiet evening, a reminder that some horrors don't announce themselves. They wait, and they remember.